Now let's look at how we can actually set default values for our arguments. So what does that mean? Essentially, if you set a default value for the argument, if somebody calls your function and doesn't supply a value for that argument, instead of PHP giving you an error, throwing you an error, as the nerds like to say, PHP will just use the default value. Now, how do you do that? Very simple. You go in, and for any arguments that you want to have a default value, you just write in whatever value you want. Now, I'm just using text, but it could be all kinds of different things, depending on how complex your code is. What I mean by different things, it could be objects if you're getting into object-oriented PHP. It can be all kinds of different things, which is beyond the scope of this video. But I just want you to understand we're just using text now to keep it simple. So basically, with this argument here, I've given it a default value of Jimmy is the best, and I left this in here, and I've given the killer PHP when we've made our call down here. I just want to show you what that does. So killer PHP, of course, is the value that we get because we've given this a value. So let's remove this. So now we're not passing a second argument to our footer function. Now remember, when we didn't set a default value, that would throw an error. That would cause PHP to barf. So let's see what happens now. As you can see, Jimmy is the best is now printed to the screen because we didn't supply, when we called this function, the second argument. PHP said, oh, well, we'll just use the default. Jimmy is the best. For each of our variables, for each of our arguments, which in essence are variables, PHP, you can set default values for them if you choose to. It's an optional thing that you can do. To finish off this little video, what I want to do is I want to show you how we could use conditional statements within our function and how it can affect behavior. So let's just simple if statement and an if else statement. All right, once again, through the magic of video tutorial, I spared you watching me type out all this stuff. So what I've done is I've changed the function a little bit. I've changed our argument, our default for the second argument to Jimmy, and I've echoed out the first argument. So I put in a conditional statement, an if statement here. You notice there's two return values. Now, essentially, the way this works is whatever I put in here, if that becomes true, this gets returned by the function. Otherwise, or else, this will get returned by the function. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say if arg is equal to, that's plus, double equal to, now you remember that double equal was our comparison operator. It compares to see if this is actually equal to whatever I put in here. And I'm going to put in here Jimmy. So if this argument is equal to Jimmy, then we're going to say we're going to return this. Otherwise, we're going to return that. So let's save that, and let's look at what we have here. So right now, when we're calling the footer function, we're not providing a second argument. So in theory, what will happen is that the default will appear. Let me just get rid of that period. The default will appear, and if the default is called, this should evaluate to true, of course, right? So let's see what happens. There we go. Hey, I know Jimmy. So let's actually now change that a little bit by adding our argument, and we're going to go Nick, and let's save that, refresh. Do I know you, Nick? So let's look again at our code. Notice here now in the call to the footer function, I provided a value for the second argument. So let's zoom up here. So if you look, all the stuff here, well, all the magic, if you will, is all in this conditional, this if statement. So essentially, give it a little space here, make it easier perhaps. So because the arg provided was not equal to Jimmy, which happens to be our default. This was false, so this was run. So return, do I know you, Nick? Of course, Nick is because that's the value we gave to footer. Now, if we just change this to Jimmy, just so that it's clear that it's not whether or not default was left in place that makes us return this statement here. It's the value found inside of this arg. So now in my call to footer, the function footer, I'm actually adding the value of Jimmy as a second argument. I'm passing the second value of Jimmy. That's what the nerds will say. You know, passing the value of Stefan, passing the value of Jimmy, yada, 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 yada. We covered that. So let's actually refresh the page. Hey, I know you, Jimmy. Of course, since we passed the value of Jimmy, args for our second argument, args is indeed equal to Jimmy, so this is returned. Next thing I want to look at is something called variable scope. I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this to you guys. Essentially, you know what a variable is, right? You know what variables are. So variable scope, think of it, the word scope, think another word might be range. So the range of a variable. Essentially what it comes down to is that variables inside of a function that we define, so inside the function, in this case, in any case, it's inside the curly brackets. This is the closing of the function, this is the opening of the function. Variables in here affect only the PHP code inside this function. And variables out here, you've noticed I created a variable called email out here, does not affect things that are going on in here. They're outside of the scope of this function. I hope that makes sense. So to make this clear, I created a variable called email here. You notice we have another email variable here, right? This email variable and this email variable are considered different entities, if you will, within the script by PHP. They will not affect each other. So let's take a look at what happens now that I define this variable here. And you see it doesn't affect the page. Email keeps its original value, which is actually derived from the passing the value here when we actually call the function. Let's try something else now. Just to be clear, what I've done is I've moved this second email variable to the bottom after the function call itself, not the function call, but after we've defined our function here, just to make it clear that these are separate from each other. Because typically in a PHP script, if I created email variable here and I created another version of email before it, which had a different value, this email would be overriding this email. Why? Because PHP would think that, oh, okay, we're changing the value of email down here. So I want it to be clear. We'll just refresh the page. Actually, let me just save this. Because this email variable is declared outside of this function, it does not affect the behavior and what happens in this function, because these variables are outside of the scope of this function. And that's what variable scope is all about. It's something you got to pay attention to, because sometimes you can get into some problems down the road as your scripts become a little bit more complex. Keep it in mind for now. Don't go crazy, but keep it in mind. To end this introduction to creating your own custom functions, I want to cover one other nerd tidbit where inside of this function we can actually define our variables as we normally would, like so. And of course we can override these variables here. So to be clear, when you create arguments for functions like so in between your brackets, you're essentially defining variables here for your function. You can define them again in here, or totally new variables, but understand when you define a variable again in here, you're essentially overriding whatever values that people send you through the arguments. So this is kind of stupid, but I just wanted to make a point that you can redeclare these variables and give them different values if you choose to. So I'll do that here. And again, another value for email. To end this off, I just want to make clear, reiterate a couple points. You can, for instance, call built-in PHP functions inside of your own custom functions, and as I'm doing here, and you can even include them inside of conditionals. Now I'm not going to fill in the values, I'm just making a point. So, but based on whatever decisions you decide that are relevant for your function, based on whatever arguments people send you or don't send you, based on what happens in your code, you can, within your conditional statements, your else statements, call other functions, whether they be built-in functions from the PHP language, or whether you call your other custom functions. This is very powerful, and you can see how you can wrap up a lot of logic and a lot of complexity inside of functions, freeing up your pages of all this clutter. So all we've done here in our PHP pages is just call the footer function and pass it a couple of arguments. So it's one line of code, simple line of code, versus lots of code in here. So it's you can see how using functions you can package up things and keep everything kind of neat. Finally, let's look at how we can include our functions that are stored in other PHP pages into our current or our working PHP page. That ultimately is the goal, where you stick all your function code in separate library files, if you will, that you can then include in your main PHP pages. This way you keep your main PHP pages, that the pages that people actually see and interact with, the pages that you actually have HTML and perhaps CSS in there, free of PHP code. This really makes sites a lot easier to maintain and update. So if you look at the top here, ooh, I deleted that again. Let me just undo that. We look at the top here, we have a typical PHP include statement where I'm including a PHP page called functions-lib.php. Let's look at that page. Functions-lib, lib is short for library, of course, only has one function there, although I could have put many functions. And you can notice there's no HTML, there's nothing else except for raw PHP code. Of course, everything is in between PHP tags. That's important that you do that. So I have my function here called footer. And in our PHP page, with the theoretically, this is the page that everybody's going to see because we got HTML and so on. So all I had to do was use the include statement to include this function library, and then I can just happily use my PHP functions wherever I feel like using them. And it could be pretty thin like this. So you can imagine I could wrap HTML code around my PHP function calls, and you're going to have a very clean page in terms of how you have your PHP interacting with your HTML and your CSS, for instance, without having all kinds of messy PHP code messing around with all your your pages that people actually see. So there you have it. We've completed our look at custom functions. We've learned how to do a whole bunch of different things, and we've learned a few basic principles about how functions encapsulate code to make it very reusable within your same page or within many different pages. For instance, in this page, we could call this function as many times as we want. You can see we have very little code on our page, relatively speaking, and we refresh the browser, we see that our function is doing its stuff over and over again. Now we could pass, versus we can change these arguments. So I can say you call, and we refresh. We see how our function reflects the different values here because we changed our arguments. I hope you found this video tutorial on functions useful. I would suggest now that you practice creating your own functions, practice using some of PHP's built-in functions to insert into your own custom functions. And you're going to see how, as you get more and more comfortable using functions, they're going to actually make your PHP code much easier to maintain and update and so on.